From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Israel says it will continue its operation in Rafah to pressure Hamas, though will keep pursuing ceasefire talks after Hamas accepted an agreement put forward by Qatar and Egypt. We'll have more with Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council. Protests over the war continuing on college campuses, raising security concerns about the upcoming Democratic convention in Chicago. My conversation with Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker about that and more this hour. Plus, Donald Trump fined again for violating the gag order in his criminal trial in New York. While here in Washington, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene could move to oust House Speaker Mike Johnson this week. Republican Congresswoman Ashley Hinson of Iowa will weigh in. We begin, though, this evening with our top story. Israel responding to news that Hamas accepted a ceasefire deal put forward by Egypt and Qatar, saying it falls short of their demands. Speaking at the White House today, John Kirby, National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator, spoke about a call that happened earlier today between President Biden and Bibi Netanyahu.
We've made clear our views about operations in Rafah that could potentially put more than 1 million innocent people at greater risk. During his call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the president again made this clear. He also made clear that we continue to believe that the hostage deal is the best way to avoid that sort of an outcome.
For more, we bring in Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisco, who covers the White House for us. So you hear that from the administration on the one hand, Michelle. Then we get the statement from the Prime Minister's office in Israel, which reads in part, the war cabinet unanimously decided this evening Israel will continue its operation in Rafah. They say that's in order to apply military pressure on Hamas to advance the release of hostages and achieve the other objectives of the war. I cannot imagine this sits well with the White House.
Yeah, well, it was always very fragile. I mean, you saw John Kirby in that briefing today. The pool report counted 58 questions that he took, and most all of them were on this issue. He was very tentative in commenting on anything. As he said, this is the most sensitive time, is where we're at this spot where we're reviewing the negotiations. We're reviewing what exactly Hamas has agreed to, and then later we learned that Israel, in fact, rejected it. So I think the U.S., in some cases, is back to, and I don't want to say square one, but back to this very fragile, very complicated situation where they're, waiting for some sign that Hamas is going to accept something that is satisfied by both the Israeli and the U.S. Sides. And we're just not there yet.
Of course, Israel says it's going to stay at the table. We'll continue to pursue a ceasefire agreement. I guess it's just a question of whether or not you can close the gap between Israel and Hamas at this point. And from the U.S. perspective, we have heard officials in the administration suggest there's not really a plan B here, that It's a ceasefire deal or not, and there's no in between.
Yeah, well, not to quote a different geopolitical conflict, but we've heard from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky talking about how you can't have a plan B in these situations. And of course, he was speaking for his own situation, but that's what it reminds me of there. Of course, the U.S. officials don't want to betray any sort of situation where they want to open up for anything else than we're laser focused on this hostage deal. We need to get the hostages out. We need to get humanitarian aid in. And they see it as an opportunity to close the deal on a ceasefire. Israel, obviously, in a different position here, has said repeatedly, and including through the weekend, that they will move forward on the Rafah operation. They want to end Hamas. And so that is their full stop negotiating tactic. And Hamas is just not seeing that as acceptable from their side, of course.
Yeah, so I guess we'll wait and see how these talks progress in the coming days. Meantime, tomorrow, President Biden will be giving an address on anti-Semitism and part of marking Holocaust Remembrance Day. He'll be speaking on Capitol Hill. Should we expect what's happening in terms of the ceasefire talks will color the remarks that he gives tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's not going to be an easy address to deliver with this hovering in the background, but I think what the president will probably try to do is completely isolate this, as he has tried to do, is, you take the U.S. support for Israel on the one hand and the ironclad commitment that they say even through today and rumors of holding back on ammunition support and that sort of thing to Israel. Even amid all that, they want to kind of establish, yes, we are still the friend to Israel that we always have been, and particularly in issues around Holocaust remembrance, around anti-Semitism. You saw it in the readout of the leaders' call this morning that they agreed, yes, we're going to forcefully fight anti-Semitism in all its forms, hate speech writ large, which will also include the other side. But I think the message tomorrow will be laser focused on Holocaust remembrance and won't include all these other things in the background that are obviously complicating U.S. strategy.
All right, Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisco, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to your coverage of that address tomorrow. Now we turn to the trial of former President Donald Trump taking place in a Manhattan courtroom again today, and the judge holding the former president in contempt again, warning of the possibility of jail time over gag order violations. Here's how the former president reacted at the end of the proceedings today.
This judge has given me a gag order and said you'll go to jail if you violate it. And frankly, you know what? Our Constitution is much more important than jail. It's not even close. I'll do that sacrifice any day.
For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Mike Dorning. So, Mike, it seems that he's almost suggesting he is willing to go to jail, and perhaps there are ways in which that could be advantageous to him politically as he and others close to him, including in Congress and elsewhere, continue to pursue this narrative that the Department of Justice, the legal system, is being weaponized against Donald Trump.
Yeah, there are ways it can be advantageous to him. I think it is a little bit risky to be running for president and as like a jailbird. But it does reinforce this narrative he has that he is someone who's willing to sacrifice himself to fight this larger fight on behalf of people in America who feel disenfranchised. He's taken the prosecutions and turned them into a validation of his critique of the United States and hit this idea that people who are discontented with America feel persecuted, and he's being persecuted on their behalf.
Speaking of discontentment, there's a lot of that going around within the Republican conference on Capitol Hill as well, in the House specifically. Donald Trump has actually come out in support of House Speaker Mike Johnson. They appeared together at Mar-a-Lago. He's had other relatively friendly words for him since, even in the face of Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who also is close to the former president, pursuing this motion to vacate against him, which technically could happen at any time. She said she'd call for a vote this week. She right now is in a meeting with the House Speaker. We have yet to hear anything emergent from that meeting, but just how critical is this moment for Speaker Johnson, knowing the Democrats could be there to protect him?
It's important. It's as you say, he will win this vote. He will win this fight because he has the Democrats for now saying they'll back him. But it's an important test for him because if he goes through this vote and she does challenge him and a number of Republicans break away, that would really weaken him because the Democratic support is not a carte blanche. They might withdraw that at any time, and you can imagine if he continues to press hardcore Republican priorities, at some point they will withdraw that. So if he loses enough Republican support that he needs the Democrats, that just really weakens him. So if he can get Marjorie Taylor Greene to somehow go through this without actually triggering an ouster motion, that would help him tremendously. It would also, not coincidentally, help President Trump and other Republicans by unifying the party instead of dividing it going into an election.
Is she politically able, though, to walk away at this point after threatening this for so long? Personally,
I think it's pretty hard for her to back down. She's been threatening this continuously. And, you know, the traditional ways that a Speaker of the House or other congressional leaders can punish someone aren't really going to matter to her. They already have taken committee seats away from her. She doesn't really, her political strength is not based on whether she can get some amendment to some bill or get an earmark in some appropriation. Her political strength is by being an avatar for the really ultra-conservative, hardline part of the party. So she gets in those fights, it just enhances her brand.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike Dorning, who helps lead our congressional coverage. Thank you so much. And of course, if and when we do get an understanding of what exactly is happening in that meeting between Marjorie Taylor Greene and Speaker Johnson, we will bring that to you. Coming up first, though, Chicago is getting ready to host this summer's Democratic National Convention. My conversation with the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, on their preparations for potential protests and more. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Columbia University today canceled their main commencement event for this school year following protests on campus in reaction to the war in Gaza. Similar protests have roiled other colleges and universities across the country and have raised concerns that other demonstrations could erupt around the Democratic National Convention in Chicago this August. Earlier today, I spoke with the Democratic governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, and I started by asking him about how his state is preparing for potential protests and what he makes of comparisons to the convention of 1968.
We have protests at every convention all over the country every 4 years, both the Democrats and the Republicans. So we expect that there'll be protests this time, just like there were last time 4 years ago and 8 years ago and back in 1996. And then, as you're saying, 1968 is an awfully long time ago, and a whole lot has changed. So we don't expect anything quite like that. But protests are, they're a normal part of a political convention, and we expect them.
Okay, so you're expecting them, Governor, but perhaps you also have to brace for the unexpected if indeed it becomes necessary to have a response. What effort do you have underway to work with local authorities statewide, perhaps, to address any safety concerns that may be arising of the convention being held? What work is already underway?
Well, we have an extensive security apparatus for this convention. There is really every 4 years now. But let me remind you that starting with the Secret Service and the FBI at the federal level, all the way to the Illinois State Police, our Chicago Police Department, not to mention the Sheriff's Office and the Deputy Sheriffs for Cook County. And then we're actually trading and working with the Milwaukee Police. The Chicago police are going to help at the Milwaukee Republican convention this year, and the Milwaukee police are coming to help us for our Democratic convention here in Chicago. So it's quite an extensive plan. It's something that the federal government is quite good at. And as you may know, there was a new bill and new funding that was provided, extensive new funding for both conventions for security. So we feel pretty good about where we stand.
All right. Well, on the subject of working with police, obviously we have seen police forces across the country in many different parts have to get involved in what's happening on college campuses, everywhere from the West Coast to the East Coast. And I wonder to what extent your administration is currently advising schools in Illinois that may be dealing with these protests that we are seeing, and what exactly you are telling them as to how they should be conducting themselves.
Well, I think we have a sort of a common understanding at all of our schools in Illinois that, that we need to protect free speech, but not hate speech, and that protests are okay. What's not okay is interfering with the operations of a university, of an academic setting. So, we've seen the protesters out. It's hundreds of protesters, depending on, what school you're talking about. But so far, relatively peaceful. So far, we haven't had a lot of police intervention. There have been one or two circumstances. But to be honest with you, the protests so far have been, the protesters and the protests have been manageable. And, we're watching it day by day. School is almost over for most of our universities, certainly our state universities in Illinois, and we've already had a bunch of graduations. So far, so good.
Well, so far, so good, perhaps in your state, Governor, and yet across the country, what this does seem to be highlighting is an issue within the Democratic Party, perhaps different fractions of it, running into conflict over the questions around Gaza and policy toward Israel. And I wonder, just thinking about party-wide, how you think your party can overcome this kind of strain and tension, especially when it's a question of whether or not these individuals who are protesting are going to be willing to go out and vote for another term for the Democratic president.
Well, let's remember that this isn't just one party that we're talking about. That is to say, we have a candidate, a Democratic candidate for president, our current president, Joe Biden, and then there's the Republican candidate. And I think all the protesters seem to understand that things would be much worse, if Donald Trump were president of the United States. He's irresponsible. He's reckless. We probably already would have been in a wide war if he had been president when October 7th had occurred. So I think that Democrats understand and young people understand. Ultimately, they've got a lot to say about the current situation and they're protesting on campus. But ultimately, I think they'll understand when they go to the polls in November that they really have two choices, and their better choice is to vote against Donald Trump.
Of course, a lot of that will likely be driven by how much money is spent in order to mobilize the voter force and get them out to the polls. And I wonder, Governor, what your own personal plans are in terms of further contributions for this campaign cycle. There's still 6 months between now and the election. How much should we expect you're willing to put forward and where?
Well, I've been a Democrat my whole life, and I've supported Democrats running for office across the country for a long, long time. And as you may know, I founded an organization that's hard at work now called Think Big America that is protecting women's reproductive rights, working to get referenda passed in places like Nevada and Arizona and Florida, Montana, because of what Donald Trump did when he appointed anti-choice Supreme Court justices. We now don't have law of the land that protects women, and so we've got to make sure we work state by state to overturn the very anti-woman agenda that's been put in place by very right-wing and extremist Republicans.
But is there a dollar figure you have in mind to advance those causes, Governor?
Well, already Think Big America, which I've funded, has dedicated millions of dollars to those efforts, and I'm going to continue to do what's necessary here. We live in a precarious moment in the history of the United States. I do believe that democracy is on the line. I also think, very importantly, that working people, working families are going to be hurt by a Trump presidency. And so I think I've got to do whatever I can. I was traveling in Michigan, all over the state, to make sure that people understood what our message is, that Joe Biden is really standing up for working families, and that Donald Trump worked to send jobs overseas when he was president. It's Joe Biden that's been standing up and protecting jobs in the United States and attracting manufacturing back to our shores. So those are messages that I'm promoting personally, and then along with that, protecting freedoms, as I mentioned, through Think Big America. So millions of dollars I've already dedicated.
Finally, Governor, we've covered a number of different issues with you today, and I sincerely appreciate your time. Another one that could factor heavily into this election cycle is the question of the border and migration, especially when there is a time in which every state is being characterized as a border state. Certainly, Illinois has felt that in the city of Chicago, especially. What further federal assistance do you expect you might receive to deal with the migrant issues you are now facing, if at all?
Well, we've asked for work permits for many of the people that have been sent here by the governor of Texas, because we have jobs available. We'd like to put everybody to work. We think that's the best way to manage the migrants that have come. And we're doing the best to manage what I would describe as a humanitarian crisis as a result of the Texas governor's mishandling and failure to do what's best for the people who are legally in this country. These are asylum seekers. Remember, the folks who are being allowed into this country have papers. And so what he's doing is trying to sow chaos, the governor of Texas. And he's sending folks to Democratic cities across the nation because he wants to have a political effect. It's political gamesmanship. But we're doing everything that we can to both care for the people who come and make sure that they get jobs. We think that more needs to be done in terms of comprehensive immigration reform. Republicans don't seem willing to come to the table. They walked away from a border security bill that the president was willing to go along with, that Democrats in Congress were willing to go along with. Why did they walk away? Because Donald Trump does not want to solve this problem. It's all politics to him. The reality is that Americans need to have a secure border, and they need to have immigration, and comprehensive immigration reform will get us there.
That was my conversation with the Democratic governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, earlier today. Coming up still here on Balance of Power, Israel rejecting a ceasefire plan that was embraced by Hamas. We'll take a deep dive into the complex situation with Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council next on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. It has been a busy day of developments in the war between Israel and Hamas and efforts towards a ceasefire agreement. The latest news, Israel's rejection of a ceasefire plan that the Hamas had embraced that was negotiated by Egypt and Qatar. Israel saying this afternoon that it will proceed with its operations in Rafah, even after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with President Biden about that and other issues earlier today. Joining us now for more is Jonathan Panikoff, director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. Jonathan, great to see you back here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Today has been a bit confusing, if I'm being frank, in terms of what exactly is happening with the ceasefire deal. We began today with thoughts that it had stalled out over the weekend, that a Hamas missile attack that had killed a number of Israeli soldiers within the last 48 hours may have disrupted things, made them more difficult. Hamas then comes out and says it agreed to something that apparently Israel is not willing to agree to. Just what is your understanding of the situation as it stands now?
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you. Right now, Israel is saying that what Hamas agreed to is not what the offer that was put on the table. In other words, they're saying Hamas is committing a bait and switch, that Hamas is agreeing to terms that Israel never agreed to, that were not negotiated by the Egyptians and by the Qataris, that right now this is about Hamas trying to pretend there's a deal, either to buy time or to try to box Israel into a corner. And it may be working if you look at protests in Tel Aviv, if you look at some of the international reaction. But whatever the reality is of what Hamas responded to, what we know is that it's not the deal that Israel signed up to just over a week ago.
So what kind of position, Jonathan, does this put Bibi Netanyahu in, domestically and abroad, when you think about how the administration is likely to be reacting to this news?
Yeah, domestically, it's a real challenge. Hostage families and Israelis as a whole have been calling for a temporary ceasefire for months now that would bring another set of hostages home. The November release of hostages seems like a lifetime ago. And really, there's increasing pressure in Israel for Benjamin Netanyahu and the coalition to make progress on the hostages being released. It's seeming more and more likely that more and more, unfortunately, have already passed away in captivity. The number of hostages originally sought by Israel was 40. There was some negotiations that seemed to indicate that Hamas may not have 40 hostages, and so the number was brought down to 33. And so domestically, obviously, families and Israelis as a whole want the hostages home. Internationally, it's a real challenge because what Netanyahu is saying now is, look, we're going to go ahead with the operation in Rafah. Mm-hmm. That is almost certainly partly to pressure Hamas, but it doesn't mean there isn't a real operation behind there, which the administration is going to be incredibly concerned about because it is not what the administration has said is okay. The administration has said you haven't done enough, Israel, to protect civilians, to protect those who need to get out. And unless you do that, Operation Rafah should not be commencing.
Well, and if they do indeed pursue that operation in Rafah in the interim between now and whenever they actually can reach an agreement, if it's at all possible, on a temporary ceasefire, would that operation not make it all the more difficult to eventually come to that kind of agreement? If Israel has already moved in to take out the remaining Hamas battalions, what incentive would Hamas have to return hostages?
Yeah, it certainly could. You're right. I think what the key is, what is the scope of the operation? In other words, what you haven't heard from Israel is whether or not the operation is a full-scale operation to clear Rafah in the same way that it cleared Gaza City, that it cleared Khan Yunis, or whether the goal here is something marginal around the edges, simply to increase the pressure. You have about 1.3 million people in Rafah, and the Israeli evacuation order today called for only about 110,000 of them in the east to leave immediately. That suggests that maybe the operation is not nearly as wide scale as folks would think a full operation would be. And so it may be as much about Israel preparing and getting pressure and laying the groundwork, not that it's immediately going to undertake an operation.
All right. It's great to kind of get you to contextualize and help us understand what exactly is happening. And frankly, this is not the conversation we necessarily thought we would be having today. All of this has been developing in real time. Something else we thought perhaps would get more attention today was the fact that over the weekend, Israel ordered the shutdown of Al Jazeera in the country. We saw a raid of those offices. Obviously, there has been accusations that Al Jazeera was working in concert with Hamas. But how should we be thinking about the distribution of information in Israel as we talk about the domestic pressures on Bibi Netanyahu? How should we read the control of what actual Israelis are getting to see, what reporting they get to see?
Look, the shutdown is very, very concerning, especially for those of us who view Israel as a liberal democracy. The reality is when you start shutting down independent television stations, even if they're reporting things that you don't like, even reporting things that you may loathe, it starts to get very, very concerning in terms of autocratic-like tendencies. Whether or not that is the case here, I think, is still an open question. One of the challenges is that Al Jazeera's programming in Arabic is not the same as Al Jazeera's programming in English. In fact, there's a long history of in Arabic of using phrasing and terminology, martyrdom, that really is, if not offensive, incredibly concerning. And so I think that balance is very hard, but it is concerning.
Yeah, and certainly as a journalist, we took note of it here at Bloomberg today. Finally, Jonathan, of course, something else we've been following here at home is the ongoing protests on college campuses across the country. Columbia University today canceled its primary main commencement proceedings. They'll have a bunch of smaller ceremonies instead, in part because of what we have seen taking place on that campus in recent weeks. To what extent do you think the protests here are influencing what is happening in the region? Is it emboldening Hamas? Is it emboldening Israel? How do you consider that factor?
I certainly think that the region is taking note of it. I mean, I think more than anything, what the region is looking at is saying, look, this is a demonstration that even if we don't have victory immediately, even if we don't have an independent Palestinian state, the reality is American youth is moving in that direction, and we should be really excited about that prospect. I think that's probably a little bit overstated, to be honest, but certainly it's having an influence and an impact on how people in the region are thinking about it. And you're hearing that messages when U.S. officials are going, when think tank academics are going, you're hearing people say, look, the view is we can just wait out Israel. We don't need to even have peace with Israel. Really, there's a much, much more pro-Palestinian youth in the U.S. that's going to come and be there to rescue us and to help us in the future. Again, I think that's a little bit of a misread, and I've cautioned some of my friends in the region against reading it as such. But it is a real issue that has to be addressed, and I think this is just the beginning of it.
All right, Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council, always great to have you here on Balance of Power. Thank you so much for joining us. And we want to get more reaction now to the developments we have seen between Israel and Hamas today from Capitol Hill. I'm pleased to say joining us is Republican Congresswoman from Iowa, Ashley Hinson. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. We have heard warnings from the Biden administration that they are against an Israeli operation in Rafah, that potentially policy could change as a result of Israel's response to the U.S.'s feelings on the matter. If we were to see the loss of further Palestinian life as a result of a ground operation in Rafah specifically, are there consequences for Israel that you would support?
Well, as of this point, I believe Hamas broke a ceasefire on October 7th. And so my steadfast support for Israel, I've made very, very clear. I think thousands of Israelis were killed on October 7th. And as a result of that, we've seen this ongoing war and devastation to the entire region, which I think is absolutely terrible. I was in Israel when Russia invaded Ukraine. I've been watching very closely how all of these conflicts are playing out geopolitically around the world. That's what I'm really concerned on. And the work I'm doing in Congress here is going to be to deter any future conflict. I think the Biden administration's weakness is why we've seen many of these foreign adversaries be emboldened in the first place. And so my goal will be to stand with our freedom-loving allies around the world. And I think that's a good investment for U.S. taxpayers.
Of course, we have already seen your colleagues in the House as well as in the Senate passing supplemental aid, not just for Israel, but Ukraine as well. It took quite some time, and potentially we could still be dealing with the ramifications in your chamber. As one of your colleagues, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, has suggested, because Ukraine aid went to the floor and she doesn't agree with how Mike Johnson has conducted himself in terms of cooperation with the Democrats, that she could force this motion to vacate vote this week. When are you bracing for that to happen?
Yeah. Well, I know that she is currently in meeting with the speaker right now, but I can tell you this, that I think Mike Johnson has done an impeccable job of leading our conference, our Republican conference, through a very, very challenging time, a very historically narrow majority. And I think we need to notch as many conservative wins as we can this year. So I do not support a motion to vacate. I didn't support the one in October for Kevin McCarthy for the speaker, and I do not support moving forward with a motion to vacate now. I think it would fail miserably. It'll be tabled on the floor, and I think that's embarrassing for them right now. We should be moving forward with our priorities, not being focused on the chaos and dysfunction that is apparently ruling this place. That's what I ran against, was coming here to actually get things done. So I'm hopeful that they're able to have a good conversation, and hopefully we can just move forward.
Well, there's a question as to what extent the speaker would be able to move forward, even if this was tabled with the help of Democrats. If it's Democrats that have to step in and save him, how weakened would he be as a leader for your conference?
I don't see him as being weakened. I think he made some decisions, and he's always leveled with members about where things are at and why he's making those decisions. As he calls it, he's going to make a play call. We saw him really step up a few weeks ago and take that initiative, and I respect that, and I know a number of members of our conference respect that. So, again, I'm hopeful in this historically narrow majority that we can hopefully notch some good wins going forward, because we have a wide open border. We have policies that are impacting inflation every single day, driving up costs for American consumers. That's what I hear about on the ground when I'm home in the district in Iowa.
Well, you speak, Congresswoman, of wanting to notch a few more wins. There, of course, is a question as to what legislatively will be accomplished between now and the election. But I know there are a few specific issues you want to pursue, including, given your role on the Select Committee on Competition with China, on delisting Chinese companies with ties to the Chinese military from U.S. exchanges. Why is that important?
Yes. This is a huge national security concern, and frankly, I can't think of a worse investment for American dollars than funneling that money right to the CCP. So Haysai is one of the companies that I've specifically targeted. They're on a DoD blacklist. We should not be doing business with them, with our U.S. military. So frankly, if they're on any kind of those blacklists, they should not be listed on an American stock exchange, plain and simple. Haysai was able to raise $190 million on their IPO. That money went right back to the Chinese Communist Party. It went right back to their facility to ramp up production and research and development of technologies that will then be used potentially against American forces. So I think this is an incredible national security risk. It's why I wrote a letter to Chair Friedman at the NASDAQ to try to get them to delist Haysai from the exchange.
So if you were to take, Congresswoman, an effort like that together with legislation that already has become law as part of that supplemental package I was referring to earlier, the divest or ban bill for TikTok, does that together not send a signal to China that Chinese companies do have fear potentially about doing business in the U.S. and what could happen in retaliation in return to U.S. companies trying to do business in China?
Yeah. Well, I think this speaks to all investors that you should be wide open with your eyes about what is going on here. American dollars are being funneled through the CCP to those causes to be used against us, to advance their military. Specifically, Haysai is a LiDAR company. They control about just under about 50% of the world global share for LiDAR technology. China has a policy where they require their companies to turn over information to them. So again, be wide open and clear about the investment there. It's why we've been talking about strategic decoupling and de-risking for American investors, because I think people need to be very clear that China could make the decision and on the flip of a coin just say, hey, we're not going to allow Americans to have access to their assets over in China. They could say, hey, we're not going to allow them to have entrance to these facilities anymore. I mean, they could do that overnight. So I think that we just need to be very, very clear about the risks to American investors here, and it's why I've been so passionate about this issue.
Well, in the spirit of clarity, Congresswoman, you just said they're decoupling, which is a phrase that this administration, the Biden administration, has actively tried not to use. The suggestion that they are diversifying, yes, decoupling, no. Should decoupling be the policy of the United States?
Well, notice I said strategic decoupling and de-risking. So we need to be thinking about the sectors that we should not have those liabilities in China. One area, for instance, pharmaceutical medications. I actually just introduced a bill to try to decrease our dependence on animal feed additives, a lot of the vitamins and minerals that are added to feed. If China was to, say, cut off those supplies, our food production would plummet here in the United States. So it's strategic decoupling and de-risking where we can, and that should be the policy of the United States.
All right, Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, the Republican from Iowa, thank you so much for joining us here. We appreciate your time. Coming up still, prosecutors say they might need to prolong Trump's hush money trial about 2 to 3 more weeks. We'll be joined by our political panel with the latest details, what it means for his campaign. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Government just said that they want 2 to 3 more weeks. That means they want to keep me off the trail for 2 to 3 more weeks. Now, anybody in there would realize there's no case. They don't have a case. Every legal scholar says they don't have a case. This is just a political witch hunt. It's election interfering. And this is really, truly election interference, and it's a disgrace.
That was former President Donald Trump leaving the courthouse in New York earlier today, saying things that are sounding pretty familiar at this point. Joining us now with more, our political panel, Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC Communications Director, and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, political science professor at Iona University. So, Lisa, to begin with you, we also today, in terms of developments in the courtroom, had the judge slapping Trump with another $1,000 fine for violating the gag order, suggesting that $1,000 fines don't seem to be an adequate deterrent for this billionaire, and that he could potentially be forced to put Trump in jail. Would that do anything other than help Trump politically as he continues this campaign?
No, I think that it would help him politically if that were the case. Everything he's saying is going to play directly into the hands of whatever kind of action is taken in the courtroom. And to me, I mean, put him behind bars, he's going to raise $1 million. And I think that he'll use that to his advantage. So unfortunately, I think it's really a very difficult needle to thread for this judge in order to really hold him back from saying anything without causing more political fire to be lit under this president in the words that he's using.
Okay, so Lisa says if he goes to jail, Jeannie, he could raise $1 million. What would happen then if he were to actually be convicted of the crimes with which he's charged? We've had so many conversations about how maybe voters would change their minds about supporting Donald Trump if he became a convicted felon. But could it also have the reverse effect, leaning more people in his favor?
You know, it could. Just looking at the latest ABC poll, though, you know, we saw about 1 in 5, plus or minus, of his supporters saying that if he's convicted in this hush money trial in New York, that they would look for another candidate to support. Now, I am not a firm believer that you could take these polls at face value because, you know, measuring what somebody's going to do in the future when they've never had this experience is hard to do. So I think we have to wait and see. But I think a conviction, by and large, would be negative for the president. But again, we don't know that for certain. This is uncharted territory, to say the least.
Well, certainly it is. And of course, while Donald Trump spent his day in court in New York today, he spent the weekend with a bunch of donors and a bunch of potential vice presidential candidates down in Palm Beach, Florida. We were calling it the sweepstakes, and we heard from a few of those Veep wannabes, including Republican Senator Tim Scott, who appeared on Meet the Press yesterday and was asked specifically about the 2024 election results. Take a listen to what he said.
Senator, will you commit to accepting the election results of 2024? Bottom line.
At the end of the day, the 47th president of the United States will be President Donald Trump, and I'm excited to give back to low inflation, low unemployment.
Wait, Senator, yes or no? Yes or no? Will you accept the election results of 2024 no matter who wins?
That is my statement.
That's the statement, Lisa, but perhaps if you want to be vice president, that's the only statement you can have for Donald Trump.
Precisely. I mean, what else is he going to say? Clearly, anything else he says would take him out of the running to be the number 2 on the ticket in November. And unfortunately, that's not great for democracy. I mean, that has never, ever happened before. We've never seen this happen. But it continues to be the talking points that are coming out of those that want to be on the ticket with Donald Trump.
Okay, so Tim Scott wants to be on the ticket with Donald Trump potentially. There's a number of others as well. Jeannie, our reporting here at Bloomberg indicates others like the Governor Doug Burgum, Senator J.D. Vance, even Senator Marco Rubio are on the short list as well. One name that continually has come up, and yet maybe some specifically in light of developments in the last week have started to doubt, is Kristi Noem after her memoir excerpts were published, including the shooting of her 14-month-old working dog, Cricket. This was something that came up in the White House press briefing today. The press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, spoke earlier to reporters about this, and this is what she said.
We find her comments from yesterday disturbing. We find them absurd. And here, this is a country that loves dogs. And you have a leader talking about putting dogs down, killing them. And that's a disturbing statement to say. I would say to her is she probably should stop digging herself in a hole.
Digging herself in a hole, Jeannie, with the public, dog-loving public, maybe. But what about with former President Trump? Does this disqualify her from being Veep, or does that actually potentially add to her qualifications?
You know, we've heard he famously doesn't like dogs that much, so perhaps there's that. You know, in addition to Cricket, of course, there's the whole issue of Kim Jong-un, which she said, you know, blamed on the ghostwriter. But of course, she also did the audio version of the book and read that. So I think this whole book has gotten her in the doghouse, Kayleigh, I'm sorry to say. And I don't see her on the short list, but I didn't see her on the short list before, primarily because of the issue of abortion. You know, for Trump to take a governor of a state where abortion is not as widely accessible as it is in other states with Republican governors who could be on that list, I think could be problematic for him. So I didn't see her on the short list despite this book.
And Jeannie, just quickly, we've talked a lot about Donald Trump, but the man he's running against, President Biden, will be making a pretty big speech tomorrow in part of Holocaust Remembrance, a speech on anti-Semitism he'll be giving on Capitol Hill. What does the president need to say, and who does he need to say it to?
You know, I think he needs to speak. I think, you know, it's hard to do, but I don't think he can think of himself tomorrow as candidate Biden. I think he has to be president of the United States and help as a teacher or somebody who is going to lead the nation in terms of how to think about a very, very tough and emotional issue. And so I hope he affirms his support for Israel. I hope he, in the strongest language, condemns any form of anti-Semitism. And I hope he defends the right to obviously speak and to protest peacefully. And I hope that he also sets out clearly the U.S. policy towards Israel and makes clear that that policy is sound and talks about any changes to that policy if there are any.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Lisa Camusa Miller are sticking with me because coming up, Democrats preparing to protect House Speaker Mike Johnson from an ouster. Marjorie Taylor Greene just walked out of a meeting with the speaker. We'll have more with our panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. House Speaker Mike Johnson just wrapped up a more than hour-long meeting with Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has said she would move to oust him through a motion to vacate this week. Emerging from the meeting, the Congresswoman did not give an update on that, but said she will be speaking with the Speaker again tomorrow. Back with us for final thoughts now, our political panel, Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC Communications Director, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. So, Lisa, you spend an hour in the room with the Speaker. You come out saying you're going to spend more time with him tomorrow. Is this signs that Marjorie Taylor Greene may be about to back off rather than double down?
Well, she's asked for so much over the course of the last couple of years that I suspect she probably went in with a list of demands to step away from this, the platform that she's standing on, because no one is in support of this motion that she has offered. But it's going to be interesting to see now what tomorrow's meeting brings and what she gets out of it.
Well, especially considering, Jeannie, that the backdrop to all of these meetings is an understanding that at least for this go-around, the motion to vacate actually isn't going to yield the vacating of the Speaker, because Democrats are going to vote to table this motion. That's the understanding this time. It's just unclear whether or not that will be the understanding going forward if she tries this again in the future.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, I think it's incumbent to remember that Donald Trump is even against her on this. So when Donald Trump is against you and he's saying it vocally over the weekend, Mike Johnson's a good guy, keep him in his job, this thing is a non-starter. And, you know, I think while Mike Johnson is having these meetings with her, I hope he is also talking to his Republican colleagues and pushing to change this rule on this motion to vacate and not wait until next year or the next Congress to do that. That needs to be done now, because this is absolutely an absurd waste of time to give somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene this much energy and focus.
Great point.
Lisa says, great point, Jeannie.
Thank you, Lisa.
Just on the subject of staying in a job, and we only have a minute left, Lisa, but we did get news on Friday of the indictment of Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar being charged with bribery, $600,000 in bribes, allegedly. There are some on the Republican side who are saying, OK, George Santos was indicted, not found guilty, and we kicked him out of Congress. Should Henry Cuellar meet the same fate when he, too, has not yet been found guilty but has been indicted?
There's a big difference between Santos and Cuellar. Cuellar has a long history of having done some really remarkable things in the House, and I think his colleagues are probably going to have a little bit of a different disposition than they did with George Santos when his own Republican Party in New York were the ones who were leading the charge to get him out of office.
Fair enough. Jeannie, though, do the Democrats risk looking hypocritical?
Yeah, you know, I think that's how the party is going to try to make it seem. I agree with Lisa. There are vast differences. But, you know, corruption, whether it's Cuellar, Menendez, it is a good story for Republicans to run on. And it feeds into the idea of a swamp in D.C. that they're hoping gets voters to support Republicans and turn against Democrats. So it's a campaign issue for sure.
All right. Jeannie Shanzano and Lisa Camuso-Miller, our wonderful political panel this evening. Thank you so much. And if you can't get enough coverage of the swamp in D.C., check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online. Thank you so much for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll be right back here tomorrow on Bloomberg Television and Radio.